All right, thank you. G'day. Hi, good morning. How you doing? It's Anthropology and Human Conditions. You see, I've changed the title yet again because someone changed it on their essay, and I thought, no, that's a good interpretation. There are many interpretations, as we've been saying. It's 25th of November. This is lecture number 10 in anthropology, and today I'm going to talk about a research project, Information. So that's the topic, but it's also a unfolding and changing plan for some research that we will do through our faculty. And I just thought I'd give you a bit of an insight into how, well, maybe it's an insight, maybe it's not that interesting, but how jumbled ideas can be slowly wrestled into coherent questions and hopefully fundable projects inside a, well, in the social sciences. So today we're talking about this project called Culture and Innovation at Two Ends of the Urban Migration. So urban migration is the topic, but the two ends are the bourgeoisie and the working class. I suppose the rich and the poor. It's about science and knowledge at both ends. That's not an opposition, but it's also about waste and surplus, I suppose, signaling some consequences of, I guess, involvement in commodity culture. And then a more specific part of the project at the end, I'll focus on the parallel to migration is tourism, travelers and expats, and tourism as an industry. It's also about travel and so on. I'll also apologize for the banging. You can see my neighbors downstairs are renovating their apartment, and it's drilling and banging, and it's distracting me. I hope it doesn't distract you. I'm starting off with the questions, right? The initial research project was inspired, I suppose, by questions about just walking around a new city, walking around the city, and thinking, how is it you get to know a city, and you get to know it in different ways, and I kind of think there are 10 million different interpretations of the city as you walk around or you ride around. Some people don't walk. Or you drive around, or in the future catch a train around the city, waiting for the metro to open. You see the city in different ways, and that's sort of a really wider interest or question. Right? More focused was editing an article by Huen and Hogan in a special issue of Education, Philosophy and Theory. They wrote about what was, they are, and I'm not saying I agree with this, but they said what was really significant about Ho Chi Minh City is tube housing and the way in which the housing could also be shops, and the footpaths were part of houses, and the front rooms were part of the road, in a way, parking for bikes. And the pavements were rented out, sort of a whole discussion around that. And I think it's not only Ho Chi Minh City, of course, not unique to the city. That wasn't their argument. Their focus was on tube housing. You know, it shouldn't really be tube housing, because it's not just a tube, it's several tubes stacked, isn't it? Those long houses where, houses in a row. Anyway, the point was that this article was written by one person that grew up in Vietnam and now lives outside in Australia, and another person who's visited sometimes. And I was thinking, as I was editing that, they won't have the same idea of the city at all. They're completely different interpretations, as does nearly everyone. You know, so, and you visit the city a few times, you have a certain interpretation or a certain view of the city, and you live here, you have a certain view. You grew up here, you have a different view. You live here for a while and your view changes. So there are many different levels of knowledge about the city, or understanding about the city, or interpretation, I think is better. So I was thinking about that as I was reading some of the literature produced about the city within anthropology. And yeah, I will put on the questions when we get to that for attendance for the discussion. Some questions about these texts, like Eric Harm's book, right, which is of great interest. Luxury and Rubble, right? This is that two sides of the story thing. Luxury and Rubble, Civility and Dispossession in the New Saigon, Eric Harms. Eric Harms is an associate professor of anthropology and Southeast Asia studies at Yale University. And he's the author of Saigon's Edge. I'll talk about that in a minute. But it's really interesting that he is like a long-term visitor who lived in the city for to do his PhD, and then that was this book, and then returned some years later with a research project, and it's on. Let me read from the back cover. Luxury and Rubble is the tale of two cities. Put on closed captions. The tale of two cities in Ho Chi Minh City. It's the story of two planned mixed-use residential and commercial developments that are changing the face of Vietnam's largest city. Since the early 1990s, such developments have been steadily reorganizing urban landscapes across the country. For many Vietnamese, they are a symbol of the country's emergence into global modernity and post-socialist economic reforms. However, they are also sites of great contestation, sparking land disputes and controversies over how to compensate evicted residents. In this penetrating ethnography, Eric Harms vividly portrays the human costs of urban reorganization as he explores the complex and sometimes contradictory experiences of individuals grappling with the forces of privatization in a socialist country. I was exaggerating with my voice there, and I shouldn't have done that. It does have, it's a blurb. They call these things in the back of a book, the cover blurb, and then there are quotes from Annie Marie Leshkowitz, who is actually interesting because she's the editor of a special collection of essays, Traders in Motion, Identities and Contestations of the Vietnamese Marketplace, with Kirsten Enders. Traders in Motion, and it's got, I'll talk about that in a bit as well. The other people writing the blurb, blurbs tell you a lot about books, but of course, remember they're written by the marketing people of the publishing company. So that's why I was launching into that kind of Eric Harms vividly portrays, like television voiceover type thing. It's the under assistant West Coast promo man who's speaking here. Author has a say in what goes on the back of their book, but not the final say. So you wonder whether all things on the back of books are agreed. There's also a quote on the back from Ananya Roy, who's a Bengali urban geographer of some significance now, as writing on comparative urbanism, especially, yeah. Once in a while, a book comes along that makes us rethink how cities and capitalism work. Luxury and Rubble is one of those, giving us new conceptual insights into urbanism and doing so through an immensely lived and beautifully narrated ethnography. So, yeah, it is really well narrated, and it is an interesting book, as the back cover blurbs say. It's got some really great maps as well. Always love a good map. But it's the tale of two parts of Saigon. Let me see if I can show you the map of the two parts. I mean, it came out in 2016, so it's now getting a bit on. It's about Phu My Hung and where's that map gone? So he lived in Phu My Hung, and then in the this doesn't show it. And part of District 2. I'm finding the older maps. So Thu Thiem is shown on this map. You see where that part of Saigon is, right? District 2, Thu Thiem area. And that's where a lot of big, new, gleaming condominium buildings have been built. And where the people that lived there in this so-called vacant land, it wasn't vacant really, but it was higgledy-piggledy development, were their properties were bought by the developers and the government, and they were, i.e. they were compensated, but some of them feel that they didn't get enough given what they saw the value of the properties were later on after these towers had been built. Of course, as you drive around that area, you see there are some parts of the city kind of shown, some parts of the older residents kind of shown in the cover. They're still there in between the thriving development. And life there has embedded in some parts of District 2, but some parts look a bit sterile in a way. And I guess that's the case of all new areas. If you go here in District 7, way down the end of Le Van Lung, you'll see these new developments that they're just towers among building lots. And it's not until the community kind of arrives and then there's some landscaping, but they're also along the streets you get these small pop-up, until there's some coffee shops and a cart selling ban tui and banseo and a guy cutting keys from a cart and another guy sitting beside the road to, I don't know, laminate your false license or something like that. It's not really a community, right? And somehow there's parts of District 2 that are on the way towards that, and parts that seem to have bedded in. And it's really interesting to see that dynamic history. And then also he traces the history of Phu My Hung from its original projection to its now manifestation of expensive Korean barbecue land, basically. Really interesting, and what I liked about this project is it's kind of in one city, but it's two separate sites, and it was high end and low end in focus, although they really overlap, which is interesting. But the other aspect of it that I first got into for this project, what started me grappling with these issues, is putting on a seminar for a global project on a project on global humanities, and Professor Professor Joyce Liu from Taiwan, who was leading the project, got me involved in the project. Wanted to have a day of the conference that we were putting on dedicated to local initiatives and NGOs. And so I got in touch with some NGOs, one of which was Endo Vietnam. And Endo Vietnam are really interesting because it's an NGO that supports various, I suppose, unrepresented or groups that don't have a voice, and issues. So they have a big coconut fiber, bamboo fiber project to replace everything from bags to clothing with bamboo products, and that's one dimension. But their biggest and longest project, and the one that they were funded for research on about 15 years ago or 16 years ago, is on the waste pickers, the people that not the organized rubbish collection that's organized in Ho Chi Minh City, where the carts are got a government license and a stamp, and they're provided, and it's all organized. But the other informally organized layer of waste pickers, and this was Ms. Lin, who heads Endo Vietnam, came and spoke, and she spoke really interestingly about organizing or unionizing effectively the waste pickers, who are hard to organize because they're largely migrant workers. They've come in from, well, this is the thing, their research about where the waste pickers are from and who they are was some survey work done in around 2005. I'm not sure of the date of that exactly, but I think it's that old. And what they found then was that most of the waste pickers were Khmer or from Cambodia or from Laos, and with low education achievement. I think only 20% of the women had advanced beyond grade 1 in school. Right, so these are people who had missed school and had migrated to the city for various reasons, and could only get work selling lottery tickets or picking waste. And that's really interesting because, well, a city this size, it's also got more and more people, has to have infrastructure to deal with its waste, and it has a formal system and an informal system. And really, without informal systems, the formal systems couldn't cope, couldn't work. So it's very interesting. And my thing, I don't know if it's come across, but is to always think about who does the work to make this institution possible. And in a way, the question is, who does the work to keep the city alive? And yeah, there's government and planners and that high level, but there's also at literally street level, and in fact gutter level, there are people who do incredible amounts of work to keep the city livable to a degree. Okay, I mean, these are the two ends. There's planners and there's high-end speculation about what infrastructure and what the city might look like, and zoning, and right, we're going to have this as the entertainment zone, and this will be the education zone, and this will be the R&D research infrastructure zone, and I'll talk about that on a different occasion. But that's one level. But at the other level, there's also organized formal and informal facilitation of the city through infrastructure work, such as food provision. So there is restaurants and registration for restaurants and so on, and then there's street food and some registration for that, and then there's you could also look at shippers. A lot of these things were revealed very much in the what's happened with when they're taken away because of the pandemic. We suddenly noticed what happened when you didn't have Grab drivers or shippers couldn't move around the city or something. That really emphasized how important they are, no matter what policy you have. You also still need people to do the work. And who are these people? Now, people have been writing about this stuff. Alison Chouet, for example, has written a book which kind of addresses those people, but I was never quite convinced. This is Dreaming of Money in Ho Chi Minh City. Okay, it's 2013, so it's getting on as well. But still, I'll read from the back in the blurb. The expanding use of money in contemporary Vietnam has been propelled by the rise of new markets, digital telecommunications, and ideological emphasis on money's autonomy from the state. People in Vietnam use the metaphor of open doors to describe their everyday experiences of market liberalization and to designate the end of Vietnam's post-war social isolation and return to a consumer-oriented environment. I mean, yeah, metaphor and money, open doors, and even just the metaphor of money, as Marx made so much of in Capital, is really interesting. But there's no mention here of, well, it says drawing on interviews with shopkeepers, bankers, vendors, and foreign investors. shopkeepers are probably as low as we go. So there's another step in the infrastructure of the city into the informal sector. The informal sector is a term attributed to Keith Hart, who's an anthropologist who I used to work with at Goldsmiths College in the University of London, and he's great guy and mind, a little bit obsessed with Kant, Immanuel Kant, but he can be forgiven for that because his writing on gambling and on anthropology as a discipline, it's always thoughtful and provocative and worthwhile. So he talked about the informal economy. I want to kind of focus in on that, because without the informal and even without the illicit economy, there can't be really the functioning of formal. Think of, I don't know, an event, and the illicit economy is outside the event. There are a football match or something. There are people who are selling tickets formally, but then there are people who are selling tickets on, the touts and so on, for sometimes making extra money out of it, but making sure every seat gets filled. Or in so many other ways, the shippers, for example, but also taxi drivers, both formal and informal, changed a little bit by Grab and Uber when it was around and so on. But they were all, it used to be, just a few years ago, it used to be you walk out onto the street and someone would be offering you a ride. That someone probably now has become a Grab driver, but I don't know, it's pretty clear that without the informal economy making things happen, the formal economy wouldn't function as well. Right? They are in a symbiotic relationship. So there's a question to be raised around that relationship between formal and informal that's still live, since Keith Hart coined the term like in the 70s, but it's still alive and still needs to be further discussed. Endo Vietnam are doing this stuff, right? And their focus is also really about having the ear of government, being advisors to government, but organising the waste pickers. And they're trying to think of solutions for processing these infrastructure needs, like presenting solutions for these difficult problems, to the city's leadership, who will then decide. Right? So they are interestingly positioned in between the waste pickers, who are being organised by them in a way, and speaking to government, the voice of them. So I wanted to do a project that updated the old Endo research about who were the waste pickers, where they're from and so on. And how to do that was the question. Without repeating that kind of survey style research that honestly, I don't think, well, I'll explain why I don't think it's the way to go. But to update it, and we found anecdotally they do know about waste pickers now. They see that whereas before more of them were from Cambodia and Laos, I think their research showed, they know from talking to people that there's a lot more people have come into the city from the Delta area. And they've come as kind of environment migrants, and that's really interesting to bring in this side because of siltation of the Mekong, because of seawater coming further up the river, destroying the possibilities for doing wet rice cultivation, agriculture industries, and the whole thing about industry in the Delta is interesting, and we'll get onto that too. And of course, the other reason for people moving away from their employment in the Delta is that the river has been dammed in other countries, and we'll need to think about dams and how that's affected the flow of the river and the annual flooding and regeneration from flooding. Anyway, there, for the purposes of this so far, people are coming into the cities because of environmental reasons, right? Because of they call it climate change. And I'm never happy with that term. Climate change strikes me as just a way of saying, avoiding saying pollution, right? And these people come to deal with pollution, basically. The project is publicity. Good. And the group that'll do it, we're going to call it something like the Urban Delta Migration Lab. And the research will confront the question of who's coming to Ho Chi Minh City. And we'll ask about this. How has it changed since Endo did the research 16 years ago or whatever? And what are the difficulties that workers face in becoming integrated in the city when they move here? But not just the waste pickers, not just the low level as well, high level workers too. So guest workers, domestic workers, climate change driven migrants, and not just in Ho Chi Minh City, although a focus of the initial part of the research has to be Ho Chi Minh City, but other cities as well where this is happening. People are moving from rural areas into cities like Kanto and Khao Mau and so on, right? I guess it's the talk of, I don't know, the United Nations or so on. They talk about anticipated increase in in migration. They call it urbanization, the growing of the city, right? But it's in migration, internal migration. And the problem is not to just simply have space and infrastructure facilities, but also how these people will be integrated into the life of the city, the culture of the city. So political, economic, environmental factors and the infrastructure of the city, but also like people bring or need culture. It's a part of what goes on. So that and a sense that there's a entrepreneurial dynamic. People are coming to the city as well, not just because there's not economic opportunities as there were perhaps 10, 15 years ago in the Delta areas. They're also coming because the city is where you make your chances. You take your chance. There's an entrepreneurial dynamic in the city, or in Vietnam in general. This is another discussion that some people have been having about how what it seems like. This one I'm still grappling with. I don't know how relevant it is, but it does seem really impresses upon a visitor's interpretation of the city that, or at least on me as a visitor, that the attitude of people, especially young people or university students, the ones that I'm in contact with first, is radically different than in England. In England, the students of University of London, right, one of the top universities in the world, they kind of feel a bit, I think, on the whole, depressed and a bit put on. Right? They live in a society where politically they're a bit frustrated by the establishment being quite conservative, the Tory Conservative Party, but even the Labour Party is pretty conservative, Tony Blair and so on, where the good times of the baby boomer generation, the 60s and the 70s and even up to the 80s and 90s, I suppose, but declining, Britpop and all that. Now, for the last 20 years, I suppose, and they get the feeling that they've been a bit ripped off. They can't get into, they're always told over and over, you won't get onto the property ladder in London. And London is an expensive city. And I mean, most people I know have moved out of London. It's very difficult to live there. It's challenging. and not surprising, stressful. But young people feel like, oh, and they're being forced to pay ridiculous fees for their. This is happening worldwide, but they were among the first to be charged huge fees for their education, and that's turned education into something more like a teaching factory, and their customers rather than students, and therefore they feel like they're owed something, but they're buying this product that won't actually even get them what that product might have got 20, 30, 40 years ago. So they feel a bit hard done by, and a bit like the world that owes them a living, and they're not going to get it. Whereas coming to Vietnam, that feeling is it's somehow different. I mean, I think this might be a bit superficial, but certainly at one level, people think you've got to pull yourself up, do it yourself, sure, but we'll be able to do it, and the life of this generation and maybe the immediately previous one is going to be better than the parents' generation, the generation before, where they were, the economy's been doing well for a number of years now. There's been growth. There's certainly the blockade is over. The economic outlook is prosperous. Sure, there are difficulties. Nobody doubts that, but there's a different attitude towards those difficulties. Like there's a more optimistic outlook, and that comes even at the lowest level, the bottom level, street level. People, it's this beverage economy kind of thinking. People think that, right, we'll start a street stall, and it's not we'll start a street stall just to make a living. That's a part of it, but it's also, and then if we can get a second one, and then a third, and then a chain, and then there's this dynamic of expansion that's not everyone will think like this, but it's very optimistic, and in a way that's refreshing, and but it's absent elsewhere, because the rest of the world has been in stagnation for at least since 2008 collapse, so 15 years, or 14 years, whatever that is, if not 40 years since the end, or since the 70s, since the OPEC oil crisis. Certainly stagnation in Japan has been the case, but most of the advanced industrial economies have not really had huge growth. And for the last 10 years, they've been bubbling along at 0.1 or just staying out of official recession, whereas China and Vietnam are in 4% and above, 6, 7, sometimes more. And that's really significant, that basically the global capitalism hasn't been moving, and the consequence of that is people, even if they don't make the immediate equation, people feel that sense of crisis, I suppose. So it's interesting that migrants move into the city with an entrepreneurial dynamic, and yet they're having to do things to survive that are pretty rough work, hard work, gathering bits of cardboard. In this photo, it's a bit of a cliche, isn't it, just to have snapped this thing, but talk about recycling cardboard and whatnot. They managed to get quite a lot on a trailer on the back of a motorbike. I'm very impressed. So there's some questions we had to put this. What you have to do when you put a research project together is a bit arbitrarily, you have to ask some questions, which are the questions of the research. But actually, really, what they are is for the people who are evaluating it's a way of telling you what this research is about. So the question is a little bit, the question and the possible answer isn't as important as describing what the research will be doing. So to show the objective of the research, you set out a number of research questions, and they're in that frame. That's the format. But what those questions are trying to do is to tell the assessors who are going to give the money to do the research what the research is about and why it's exciting and relevant. You got to really think about what your questions will be. So we've done that with the University of Essex and with some others in Hanoi and in Da Nang, some academics who work in this area, Vietnamese academics. We've come up with some questions. And they're basically the migrant level, the in-migration level question is, well, what do migrating and displaced citizens need to facilitate their integration into the city? What are people's needs in Can Tho, Kamau, Ho Chi Minh City? What infrastructural needs need that? But then, of course, we have to talk about the class makeup of in-migration. So does migration differ according to which city, which sector, which class, which regions, ending location, all those aspects of who people are, where they're coming from, and why they're coming, so the different levels and so on. Then you need to think about a strategy for how you do the research. And this is where I want to talk about why not surveys, right? We want to involve the people who are the subject of the research, so to speak, the informants in normal anthropology talk, right? The people that you go and observe and participate with. We want to involve them more in the research, actually in the making of the research and in the ownership of the research. So it's knowledge about them, so they should have a say in what knowledge is collected and what happens to that. So one way to start that process, that's not how many people think about research, is to participate in different kinds of research strategies that involve people in it, in making stuff, making the knowledge, making the material. So I use mapping for that. And there are other ways. There are lots of other ways. Survey is one. I'm not saying surveys aren't good ways of getting information. Well, I've sometimes said that, but I think surveys are quite useful, not because of the answers you get for your survey question, because I kind of think you think of what the answers you want to get, and then you write the questions so you can get those answers. A bit like these questions for the research proposal. But the good thing about a survey is you go to a place to do the survey, and that's an excuse to have more interesting conversations with the people as they're filling out the form. And I've seen cases where people have gone to, survey women from the community, but they've had to get the men to organize the women and help them fill out the forms. And so it's not... there's a rhetoric of objectivity or something in surveyed work, somehow more scientific, but I think that's pretty bogus. But why it's useful is that you can then have an opportunity to talk to people and hang out with them and so on. It's a strategic thing. But so also is making maps, and it works with kids especially, but students and in schools and in community groups, to get people to write their own geography map of their community where they live and so on. And it's really interesting as you go from people who are trying to very carefully put down what is really there in geography, and then asking them to make it like what's relevant in this geography for you. You start with everyone kind of drawing the same kind of map, but then by the end of it, when you've asked them to say what in the geography is relevant to you, you end up with, say, in a group of 30 different maps. I demonstrated this in class when we in one of my classes I got people to draw maps of Vietnam, and everyone was very carefully putting north at the top and south at the bottom and getting the curve right and so on. But then asked them to put in where they were born and where they went to school and what they did and what's significant for them and where they've been. And we went from having 30 maps that were heading towards being the same to having 30 completely different maps. And because we talked about history of map making as well, some people scrapped the original map and made the map that didn't necessarily have north at the top, because older maps of Vietnam, right, they have the mountains at the top and the sea at the bottom. It's like west east, and that's very interesting, because traditionally maps from China, for example, had an east at the top. North isn't necessarily always at the top. Anyway, that's just another interpretive habit that we have got into and think it's true that North is at the top, but it doesn't need to be, and it wasn't always. I'm from Australia. We like to think of Australia as being at the top. Craziness, not really true, but it's a provocative thought to flip the map and see that everyone can have a different interpretation. Anyway, what's the best way to map? So that's one way to involve people in the research, and then expanding from there to get them to have a say in what knowledge is produced about them, and then what happens with that knowledge. That's difficult, because this is setting up where we'll need considerable funding, because we need to, if the people are the researchers, we need to pay them as researchers. Not just pay them as informants, give them a bit of tobacco or some beads like Levi-Strauss did, right? To actually give them a salary the same as a researcher's salary. And they won't have PhDs and credentials, so getting the university to accept that as well is difficult. But they're the ones who know, right? So they should be the researchers. They know who provides the services, and they find out where they are. They do the research and look at how they're designed and distributed, marketed and consumed. The people who provide those services are not the ones to do that research, because they're in the business of marketing those services. Right? So of course they're going to say their stuff's more important. Well, that's one set of interpretation, the providers of the research, but the consumer's point of view is also a part of the story. And they generate knowledge about what they're getting into. Of course they do, right? And it's a assumption and a prejudice even to think that their knowledge of the city isn't as viable as someone who's an urban geographer planning everything and trained in various methods. I mean, the fact of training, that training, getting someone who's got street level knowledge and street smarts, whatever, getting them to learn how to do research is less difficult than convincing the university to pay them for that. Anyway, we're doing that. Another part of it is to ask what's involved in thinking about these needs, provision, and assessment of that in context of the very reality of people needing to struggle to survive and doing things that, you know, as participant observers, someone like me wouldn't do or couldn't do. If I did it, it would be a little bit like a sensation, or somehow a bit performative and a kind of not genuine, right? People would stare, for starters. White guy doing that. Why is he doing that? Well, he's crazy. Foreigners. But even getting research assistants to do it, it's a little bit staged, right? Whereas paying these members of the waste pickers community, paying them for their time, because after all, remember, they're doing work that there's a struggle to survive, right? They're doing work that many of us wouldn't do. What's interesting about these photos, these are from the Endo program, right? Is look at these. What do you see about these photographs? Remember, I'm always asking you to read photos. But here, the photographer snuck up behind them to take a photo. I mean, it's really significant. It's not a portrait shot. These people are working for a living. Again, snuck up behind them. The one frontal photo that's on the website is this one, taken from the perspective of the rubbish. But it also looks a bit staged, right? This person wouldn't be sorting the rubbish with someone sitting in the bin taking the picture. which is think of Azule and the co-production, the responsibility for who's in the shot, camera person, but also who's in the front of the camera having a bit of a say in what gets photographed. This person has at least tolerated the strange situation of someone wanting to take a photograph of the sorting of rubbish. Very interesting. So they are already involved in the research. Our suggestion is that maybe such people need to be not snuck up behind, and with the idea of the ethnographer looking over their shoulder at what they're doing, like some kind of perverted voyeur, to actually pay these people to take time out from this pretty rough work to write about, generate the knowledge themselves. Right, but a big part of it is also contextualizing. So there are so many factors. I've already mentioned, sorry, wrong slide. The issues facing the Mekong Delta, resettlement programs, drought and flooding, which is contradictory but real. Some parts of the area are in drought, and there's not sufficient flow of water of the river because of the upstream dams, and the whole upstream dam, and in other countries. And the whole question of large dams and whether they're both effective and environmentally sound is a whole debate. Pretty much a dam has a life of 30 to 50 years, so it's not a long-term proposition at all. So then you have to, once you start damming, that lasts for a while. You generate hydropower, but then you have to also you generate a certain level of power and so on, but that declines as the dam itself silts up, and the amount of water that it can contain becomes less, so there's more overflow and so on. So you build yet another dam, and we're getting to the 30s and 50s in terms of dams on the Mekong now. So and that slows down the flow of water into the lake in Cambodia, which floods and floods the delta area annually, and those floods don't always work now, so hence drought. At the same time, flooding as the rising sea levels and all of that. And the UN saying things like Ho Chi Minh City will need to deal with a further 10 million migrants coming into the city in the next 20 years or something, 30 years. I mean, 2050, much of it's going to be underwater, and there's going to be an extra 10 million people living here. How are we going to get them canoes or even motorbikes to go on this? What are the streets going to look like with an extra 10 million people all on a 50cc Honda? These are real issues that affect the specifics of the waste pickers. So it's not only about seeing what they're doing, sneaking up behind them and photographing them, like we see in these photos, but also thinking about the context. And a lot of international scholars have done research that's widely relevant and available. This is a comment by Mike Tatarski and the Mekong Review. Mike is a journalist who works for Saigonia, and he runs a weekly newsletter on issues. Mostly it's been about COVID lately, but he follows a few other issues like the metro and the airlines and the Ving Group and so on. And he's made a pretty valid complaint that usually social science studies of migrants, there's lots of information available, but they don't really they don't do the ethnography. And sometimes a magazine article might have that, but that's not really detailed, serious work. And often the photographs are just, as I say, people sneaking up behind people and working when you should pay people for their time. Right? So this is important. There's also work on other deltas that's part of the context. Right? So I'm quite close to some researchers that work on the Sundarbans in India and Bangladesh, right? And in a way, the Sundarbans Delta is comparable to the Mekong Delta. But basically, the Mekong, right, is a river that flows down from the Himalayas, from the Chinese side, goes through what countries does it go through? China, Burma, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, right? And that's on running basically from the mountains, the Himalaya, into the sea in the delta, and siltation has made the delta and so on. A very similar process on the other side of the Himalayas is the Ganga, the Ganges river basin, and then delta. The delta of the Ganges, which is also quite far from the Himalayas, not as far, I guess, is into the Bay of Bengal, and in this area of Bangladesh and India, the two Bengals, East Bengal and West Bengal, split in going back to the period of the British. Comparing these two deltas is instructive because they're very different in similar environments, but very different in political economy in human terms. Because, all right, historically, there's colonialism in both cases, with the English and the French, and there's wars, although less war in the British case, but there were conflicts. I mean, the Sundarbans, well, there was colonial occupation, but there was also the World War II was fought over, not exactly the Delta area, but the Chittagong port, when the Indian National Army and the Japanese were fighting against the British in Myanmar, from Singapore up to Myanmar and into the northern hill states. It was close to that area, and they displaced refugees into the Sundarbans sort of area. And then there was the Naxalite communist insurgency from the mid-60s onwards, the Naxalites and the repression of the Naxalites, and the Bangladesh, then East Pakistan, West Pakistan war, the war to establish Bangladesh, because it was formerly East Pakistan, in 1971. But not as much war, but also just the attitude of governments to people. During the conflict in Vietnam, the Americans and the Diem regime, and before them the French, but mainly the Americans, I think, with napalm and with policy of protecting villages, destroying villages to save them, kind of logic. There was depopulation of the rural areas, dragging people into the city, and napalming huge areas and so on. And then after the war, these areas were seen as opportunity for industrialized agriculture and other industries. Largely it was wet rice cultivation, and it became the most productive food source for Vietnam, massively providing. And siltation is affecting that, which is interesting, because now it's government policy to diversify the trade, the economy in the Mekong Delta area. So not just rice cultivation. It was never just rice cultivation. There's sugar and other agriculture, but also other industries, some of which is being forced into closure because of the environmental changes, but other new opportunities are arising as well. Right? So infrastructure work, water building engineers are needed for that, and workers needed to build it. It's really interesting to go and visit the very tip to see how our land is being reclaimed more and more. Workers on ecosystems and mangrove, dealing with erosion and salinization is a big issue, right? But the difference between the delta in the Mekong is that it was seen as a place for people to work, to have livelihoods in agriculture or industry, compared to the Sundarbans, where migrants, they weren't workers, they weren't jobs, had fled from the war, or fled from what became Bangladesh, or tried to settle in the Sundarbans area because it was largely empty as well. But they were forced out by the state government because the national government, because India basically had absorbed the ideology of the World Wildlife Fund to say this is going to be a national park, and it's an environment for I have a picture of them somewhere for tigers, these guys, and not for people, right? And sure, the tiger is pretty much gone from the Mekong Delta, and you have to read all the histories to find the anxiety of villages for tigers and so on. Well, that's still existing in the Sundarbans today because of this World Wildlife kind of ideology or sponsored ideology of leaving the jungle for the people. And Anu Jalai and Amitej Mukhopadhyay, and it's Amitej who's going to come and talk at the conference in December that we're having. They've written really interesting books on, I've got down here somewhere, actually got them out, on the Sundarbans, on the relationship between people and animals, and also people and environment, because increasingly cyclones are the so-called 100-year storm, right? The only storm so severe it only happens once every 100 years, has been happening every 10 years or less now. And I know there are also storms in the Sundarbans, in the Mekong Delta, but maybe not the same severity as things like Cyclone Amphan last year, which for a community already assaulted by COVID, a devastating cyclone was just what they needed, not. Anyway, Anu Jalai writes really interesting stuff about the relationship between people and animals, tiger people. I mean, it's not custodians of the jungle type stuff, but it is about living alongside it. But the government policy really is largely to limit people being in that delta. So it's a real contrast, and yet really similar at the same time. There's something to be learned from that, but I don't yet know how to make the research project include this aspect. So there are some bigger things that must shape the on-the-ground ethnography of migrants and waste pickers and street sellers and so on, that affect in internal migration in a country, and have an impact, but are not observable in the ethnographic, in the fieldwork part, right? They're theoretical. Climate, so-called climate change, let's say pollution. The 100 largest corporations producing 70% of the world's pollution. Climate change is the way to avoid saying blame, accepting responsibility. All right, but so that's a factor that's kind of outside. It's observable, but it's an influencing factor of larger significance than just in the city. And then the global economy being in stagnation. So that's a reason for people having to move from the rural as well. And that's a real factor. And then questions of infrastructure and planning in relationship to people. Who really does, without having done the research work to find out what the people's needs are and what they say their needs are? Right? You can't really plan a city, except that planners do, and they do under the sway of, what was it that was described here? Market liberalization, consumer consumer-oriented environment, and the rise of new markets, digital telecommunications, and ideological emphasis on autonomy from the state. So the digital, and so I suppose not just the fact that everybody gets a phone, but that the economy can move to high tech from being an economy based on factory work and labor of factory production to one which was possible because of providing cheap labor in these special economic zones was attractive to companies. The gamble there, we'll talk about it next week, I think, is that, or in 2 weeks, is that then that's a way to flip the economy to get technology to transfer, flip the economy to a high-tech development. That leaves some questions, like you can zone parts of the city to be high-tech zones or R&D zones or special economic zones and have this higher production and maybe higher wages for the workers, but you still also need a community. You still produce waste, you still need lunches, you still need transport, or it's not just high-tech workers that work in the high-tech digitized economy. There's a whole lot of other workers doing the work to facilitate that, just as there are in any other community. So the question of who does the work in the city is really still important. Okay. Also, that migrants from the Delta and just internal migrants as well, and not all poor. There's also wealthy migrants that come to the city looking for opportunities. And they will include people who've made their money from agriculture in the Delta or from industry in the Delta, but also expats and experts that come, so-called experts, that come from overseas and so on. You know, and I guess this is where the two levels of this research project have to be grappled with. There's the street level workers that are migrants who have come into the city and they don't have infrastructural support. And then there's a lot of infrastructural support for the so-called experts, you know, who might come and work in a special economic zone or be setting up their own business and so on. And there's massive government support for them, facilitating visas, right? I mean, it's really difficult actually to get in and out of the country now for an expert, but there is expert visa, right? And there is a process for doing that. Whereas at the lower level, migrants are largely illicit, illegal migrants. They're having to come in under the wire or leave under the wire. So yeah, there's infrastructure support for the high-end migrants, richer migrants, which is something to be studied as well. And I think the two are, as I was saying at the beginning, two are combined because one is formal economy and one is informal. And without the relationship of the two, the formal and the informal can't work, right? The R&D sites, the special economic zones and so on, they can't function without a kind of periphery of other workers that make it possible for the high-tech workers to do high-tech work. Right? There's got to be someone running the canteen. There's got to be a stall selling coffee on the way to work. You know, not just coffee, cappuccino or latte or whatever that belongs to the culture of high-end, and that is facilitated by the informal and sometimes illicit economy. You need cleaners and maids to look after the kids, and you need. There's a whole lot of jobs that belong to the high-tech industry that aren't high-tech jobs. In fact, there's probably more jobs of servicing that industry than there are high-tech jobs. But that remains to be set out through ethnography, right? But it does have a non-ethnographic, a kind of bigger side to it as well. So there's that. Now, trying to grapple with this research project to include the fact that the informants themselves will be paid as the researchers is an added kind of difficulty, but I think it's really necessary because this knowledge that's generated should be owned by the people that it's about. They should have a say in what happens with the knowledge, because otherwise, what's the role of an anthropologist? Is it to find out about these people and tell the government? And I don't mean just in Vietnam, I mean any government. Is that the role of anthropology, to find out about what people are doing and then advise the planners who, yeah, they do need to be advised, but surely the informants or the community, the residents, the workers, the ones who do the research should have a say over what happens to the knowledge they produced. Right? This is an argument that requires a really significant shift in the way we think about what anthropology is. Anthropology as a collaboration between someone who's trained in research and someone who knows the situation, and passing on some of that training to them will require a rethink of what a researcher, what the role of a researcher is, right? And this approach has been discussed quite a bit in terms of those who study urban life, because now there's a talk, and Ananya Roy, who put the blurb on the back of Eric Harms's book, right? She is one of the ones that leads this discussion about rethinking the way in which urban comparison and research on the urban is, it can't continue to be like the great anthropologist goes out into the field and or the coalface and then reports back to the institution as if that's a separate space, and so on. So long as that remains the mode of operation, there's really a ventriloquy. People are speaking for the people who have the knowledge, actually, and we need to maybe challenge that. Why do we need to challenge that? Well, I don't know, I have the feeling we need to challenge that, but we also can see that that's actually already being challenged a bit when some governments have recognized that actually that informal economy is a big part of the economy, and they want to have measurement of it so they can brag about value production. That they've underestimated the value production of the informal economy. And when they talked about GDP or growth stats and so on, you talk about your GDP or your projected growth, but they haven't taken into account all of the value production made in the periphery of the formal economy. And in fact, the periphery of the formal economy is perhaps bigger, as I've been saying, than the formal economy itself. So there are some, Brinsky and Drew, ISTAT, DTAT, government agencies who are starting to say, we need to have an idea of who's doing this work in the informal economy and how that facilitates the economy, GDP production, and to include migrant, transient, illicit, and informal sectors in calculations of GDP. Now, that's a bit weird to get your head around. So is service work like ticketing, touts, or illegal production of documents, or sex work, prostitution, are they a part of value production, those service sector jobs, service sector? Well, they are employments, and that's a really interesting dimension of this research. It needs to be folded in somehow, and I'm not yet sure exactly how we will do that. What I can talk about in detail is maybe now, just quickly before the end, is the tourism side of this, because the other level that's part of the economy is tourism, and especially these are it's not migration, it's visiting, it's movement of people, but there's a whole economy around it that includes those who are migrants that work in tourism studies or work in tourism industry, and tourism studies the tourism industry. But so I've got this concept within this research, and I still have to work to integrate it more, that we can rethink what tourism studies should be, with the idea of ethnography driving that. That tourism studies shouldn't just be, again, tourism studies like market research for tourist companies. I mean, that can be a part of it, but who really wants to do that? That's in the context of world crisis, global slump and stagnation. Even though within that context, tourism has been a growth economy, one of the largest parts of the economy alongside weapons. The arms trade is huge, and tourism is huge as economy. We need to take them seriously and look at their questions of not just market research, their impact on other sectors of society, their role in the economy, questions of provision of culture, how culture is transformed in terms of authenticity or not. Think of the Trobrians putting on cultural performance to tourist visitors, right? Support work in the service sector, the context of that, right? Strikes me that the opportunity to introduce the anthropology of tourism into tourism studies is huge. And to think of tourism as a kind of study as well, that's really a focus for me, is that the possibility of thinking of or rethinking tourism as a kind of anthropological study. Well, let's say we recognize that tourists do a kind of research. They check on TripAdvisor. They remember where we talked about this week ago or 2 weeks ago. Anthropologists are like tourists. Well, tourists are like researchers in some ways, because they do their research in advance. The problem is that they have a kind of they're restricted in what representations are there for them to do this research, which is why some of the studies in market research, in brand presentation and so on are important, because you do want people to be a bit more informed about what they're getting into. And so, a visitor coming to Vietnam, think about what they or a migrant coming into the city, think about what they know of the place before they come and how they got to know of it. So, and it's probably very different for low-income migrants coming into the city, who are coming to basically leaving situations where they can't survive to try and survive in the city. Their view of the city is going to be radically different than the tourists who are coming because they heard about, they've always wanted to go to Vietnam because of, I don't know, a mix of images that they've got of Vietnam as a place of beaches and good food and people wearing ao dai and non-la hats riding bicycles, right? That's the image that they got from films like Good Morning Vietnam with Robin Williams or and so on. Or they're coming for a kind of war tourism to see the sights of going to Vietnam, to see how the country is rebuilt after the wars that they've seen in these films. Or they've got some information from other people that have been, either in travel guides, Lonely Planet or something, or more now the chit chat that you see on TripAdvisor and Traveloka, these websites that are effectively travelers, tourists chatting to each other about what's good, what you want to go to. Right? Hey, there's this new beach down near, I don't know, the far end of Phu Quoc or something like that, that you've got to go to. Unfortunately, once somebody said that on TripAdvisor, that beach has probably got about 6 months before it's overcrowded and polluted. But by the by, they build up. Somebody who hasn't yet been to Vietnam has an idea of Vietnam, what they're going to come and see. And then, in fact, that shapes what they do see, modified only by experience they have with the people they meet, which is why it's really interesting to think of really important to think of the people who work in those service sectors as skilled knowledge producers who study tourism as well. And they're introducing tourists to the world of Vietnam, which either confirms their prejudices or does something different. And there's an interesting dimension in that for this project. Renewed engagement with political, post-colonial and ontological perspectives in anthropology can come along with this, right? Including relationship with animals and so on. Think about, I don't know, Monkey Island or questions about national parks and field work. The whole premise of anthropology as being about going to have a look for yourself fits with tourism. The pleasures of discovery, of putting yourself in the way of being surprised by finding stuff out, is really has a potential to make us rethink what tourism could be. It could be the search for a more authentic or a more honest understanding of places that you visit. Because a lot of tourism nowadays is not just go to the beach and relax on your holiday. It's to do something that either celebrates the country. So for domestic tourists, it's often to see our country at last, right? And so, or it's for international tourists, it's about to know more about what happened to this place that we've heard a bit about from films that we maybe even don't even quite trust or something. You know? We'll talk about that representation of Vietnam in films necessarily in a different course, but people do build up a kind of set of impressions of the country before they come. And then some of them get confirmed and some don't. And that's up to do. And if we rethought or recognize that tourists are kind of doing research. I mean, a lot of them now also want to go, international tourists anyway, want to go to more authentic or more ethical forms of tourism. They want to do homestays because they want to find out about what everyday life is like for average. Someone doing a homestay is hardly average, but anyway, average Vietnamese. Or they want to go to something that's got ecological or ethical dimensions. Some of them want to do volunteer work to support, I don't know, to do teaching of village communities or building a dam or building a well. My niece has been on one of these tours where they pay quite a lot of money in Australia to an Australian company that then facilitates these tours where the tour group, instead of having a holiday on the beach, they go to a village and build a well or build a retaining wall or something, do something around erosion, and they come back. They've all had a fulfilling experience, and they've done good because they built a well. Even though if you just took the money that they paid and gave it to the village to build their own well, that might, anyway. I don't need to get into a critique of that form of tourism, but it's there. Even though we talk about going to have a look for yourself, that's been a rallying cry, and that's if tourism is going to have a look for yourself, it's slightly problematic because increased tourism is necessarily reduces the varieties of difference that will be available, because it terraforms the world for tourism. But at the same time, our situation is such that there's the generation of texts about anthropology of tourism is limited, even when it's taken into account by more, like, anthropology of tourism is more effective when it's about heritage than it is when it's about anthropology. It's recognized more by museums and by tourist heritage site conservationists and so on than it is by those who read ethnography. So there's a real practical dimension to the anthropology of tourism, but we need to take that into account. But really, the big factor that's at play here is in the last 2 years that tourism economy has collapsed. And that's something significant and that deserves attention and study. As much as some researchers might have a kind of COVID fatigue, and there's a time where there were just too many papers of my expertise and COVID. But certainly the impact of the pandemic on the tourism industry in Vietnam has been devastating. The domestic tourism industry is not big enough to replace the jobs lost from the tourism industry because of the pandemic. One of these bamboo hut resorts near Can Tho that we visited under the pandemic times used to have 40 employees and like 20 huts or something for people to stay, but only had 2 employees. And the 38 employees that had been let go previously had jobs, right? We're not kept on a retainer or said, well, you'll be, when we open again, you'll get your job back. No, they had to go and find other work to survive, and it's been nearly 2 years now. So they're by now they're either had to move away or something, had to go to the big city to get work, or they found work that they'll probably stay in. It's going to be difficult to restart the economy, simply because, first of all, borders won't open immediately completely, so you can't really have a full return to the levels of tourism that we had in 2019, which was 7 million visitors a year. That's a huge number for a relatively small country. 7 million visitors in 2019, and I think it was 3,000 in the no, it was more than 3,000 in the first 2 months, but in the rest of the year it was 3,000, and this year it's something like that as well, mostly experts. So the travel industry has been massively affected by this job losses and so on. And also there's, of course, in the wake of the pandemic, a kind of virtual tourism has come up. I don't know whether that has really happened so much in Vietnam. You can't really have a virtual banh mi and enjoy it, and you can't have a virtual beach experience. But in history, heritage tours, you can do that online, which is really interesting. I mean, I've been doing one every nearly 2 weeks for Calcutta just to stay in touch. And there are companies that do this kind of virtual tours, walking tours of monuments and historic areas of the city. That's possibly, but it's nowhere near, it's not going to be a growth that will catch up with the 7 million. And where's the business model for it? Yeah, people can pay a ticket price, but it's not anywhere near like paying for accommodation. And the domestic industry won't replace those 7 million either, despite the fantastic slogan, Vietnam, right? Or the new one, which is live fully in Vietnam. And here's the bridge up near Da Nang, right? And every other picture I've ever seen of this bridge has had about 150 people on the bridge, and this one significantly has just one. And kind of it says a lot. awaken your senses to new sights. So awaken your sense of vision, it must be. But yeah, there's certainly a new sight. The mountains there are fantastic. I've ridden over them on motorbike. Many of you probably have as well. As you're coming down at night into Da Nang, the road from Hue to Da Nang, fantastic views, and we're stopping and all that, and you can see this area shimmering kind of up in the mountain. It's magnificent, sure. People should live fully to do that ride and so on. But without the infrastructure and borders open, the pandemic has put a hole in that, and that needs to be written about and studied, because these livelihood opportunities have been lost, and that reinforces inequalities and anxieties about that and frustration about that. Yeah. So, not to say that everything about the tourism economy was great, right? There's also dimensions of tourism that are problematic, right? They're less than progressive, but there's also potential, like fat tourists coming to just sit on the beach and consume isn't necessarily progressive in any way. And ecotourism can be a bit better, but it's quite often ecotourism is only rhetorically green. You know, you still got to fly a high consumption jet liner into the country to get those tourists to their green destinations so they can eat their mung beans or whatever. I mean, what? Yeah. Anyway, all of these ideas have to now be contained and organized into a formal paper that requests funding. Actually, I should have had examples of the kind of forms you have to fill in with budgets and so on. And the idea that this kind of reflection on all the possible effects and impacts on migration, on people's livelihoods and jobs in tourism and so on, to fit all of those, grappling with all of those questions into a form that has money values for different activities is a very strange and occult, magical thinking practice, right? Because you've got to transform the nitty-gritty of debate, of contested interpretation of, as I said, everyone in the city has their own interpretation of what's going on and their own knowledges, to then turn that into a formulaic budget proposal, and with paragraphs describing how much time you'll spend doing this, and this, map making, and then feedback, and then writing up, and then presenting at conferences. Already they're thinking in advance on the form. You have to say already what the outcomes will be. All of that is, I should have shown a form to describe how difficult that is, because the idea is surely of study is to see if you can find something new that changes the way you think, right? All of this is to try and get us to, for me anyway, to get me and to get us and the research team and then the people that read our work to think about these issues in a new way, to find out something that is new. And then on the form, you have to say what it is you're going to find out and say how you're going to disseminate it, how you're going to tell people. You can't know how you're going to tell people what you don't yet know, because you haven't found it out, because you haven't done the research. But so the form is a real contradiction. The idea of research is that you know that there's an area, right? All these things we've just discussed: tourism, pandemic, global slump and stagnation, and environment, and the Mekong, and comparative deltas, and who does the work, and NGOs being spokespeople for waste pickers who actually have the knowledge. All of those issues then grappled with, forced into a form with a formula that talks about outcomes. is not what research is, because research is about taking all of those contextual things and looking for what you, like, knowing that there's some, you need to find out what's going on with the people that are doing that kind of work that you don't yet know. Research is about finding out, it's searching for the knowledge, searching for things that you don't yet know that will change the way you think, because you don't search for something that you already know exists. And that's the problem with the survey method. You kind of produce a survey to confirm what you wanted to find out. Very often, basically, that's what you're doing. Whereas with ethnography and with working with people, looking over their shoulder or actually working with them, you're waiting for something to happen. You're waiting to see what it is so that you can then interpret and understand it. You're also trying to know all those contexts so that you see how they are shaping the interpretation that you will make during the research. When you go out to sit and talk with and work with these so-called informants, who you really ought to be paying. I don't know, there's a dilemma involved in forcing that into the research application form and winning a grant, and everyone saying, congratulations, you won a grant, that's really great, prestigious, and so on. Whereas in fact, it kind of can compromise the open idea of just inquiry, wanting to go and have a look for yourself because you're interested, not because somebody's going to pay you. But that's another dilemma of the world in which we're in. That's part of the commercialization of knowledge and commodification of research and of the university. And I can talk about that for hours, and I shouldn't. It'll just depress us and me. Let me stop. We'll go to the have some questions and discussion of them after a short break, and I'll move to the